Last summer, I started going for walks at night. It was a good way to get rid of life's stresses. The things that depressed me the most were working and trying to be a good parent to my daughter. During the school year, it was easier when she was in daycare and I was at work. But from late June through early September, it was impossible. I couldn't leave her home alone, and I didn't leave work until 3 p.m. at the earliest. So she needed daycare, which put an even bigger financial burden on us, which in turn meant that I often had to work longer hours. The struggles of life as a single parent often discolored my perception of the world. Countless days lost their brightness, and I fell into a deep depression. I did my best to remain a beacon of safety for my daughter, but I knew she could see my desperation. Children have good intuition when it comes to their parents' emotions. She was my only comfort, and I made sure our home remained a stable place for her development. After putting her to bed one evening, I sat on the porch for a while and watched the sunset. As the last pink rays disappeared behind the trees, I stared up into a dark blue sky studded with faint stars. For the first time in months, colors returned to life. I went into the house to check on my daughter, who was already sound asleep. I slipped quietly out the front door and carefully closed it behind me. I figured my little walk wouldn't do any harm. The night air was refreshing, and the Pennsylvania backroads where I lived were quiet except for the likely buzzing of insects. There were only a few houses on my street, nestled amidst dense thickets of woods. At the end of the road, about a mile from my house, stood a small village church that no longer had any parishioners. I reached it and took a lap around the empty parking lot before heading home. By the time I was back on the porch, almost an hour had passed. I wanted to stay longer, but I had to go to work the next morning. As I went to bed that night, I realized I had something new I enjoyed doing, and the world was a little brighter. For the rest of the summer, I continued to take night walks too, and from church. It was my one refuge from life, where I could just enjoy myself without responsibility. I even started leaving my cell phone at home to avoid distractions. I'm sure the neighbors thought I was weird, because some of them would occasionally drive past me on the dark, narrow road. I always waved and smiled at them as they drove by, but I could only imagine what it would be like to drive through a tunnel among the trees on a dark night and see someone on the side of the road. I had probably unwittingly scared the hell out of at least one person. Eventually, the air began to deteriorate, and the leaves turned crisp and brown. I continued my usual walks through the fall, but soon it became too cold to continue. I had to stop for the winter, and once again, the colors disappeared from the world. Two things kept me going: my daughter and the certainty that I would be able to resume my nightly walks as soon as the warm weather settled in. After a few months that took forever, spring reasserted itself. The grass was as green as an Easter basket, and the barren woods were showing little leaves. My daughter was happy to be able to play outside, and I was thankful to be back to the one activity that brought peace to my life. Blissfully unaware that this activity would soon become the catalyst that would tear my life apart. It was the beginning of July. I reached the old church and was surprised to find the parking lot occupied this time. To the side of the building, where the parking lot ended and the wooded area began, was a single van with no lettering. It was white in color and had no windows, except for the doors on the driver and passenger side. It was exactly the kind of van one would imagine a balding old man handing out candy to children. I was very uncomfortable when I saw this vehicle, but I forced myself not to think about it too much. I told myself that someone was transporting something to or from the old church and left the van there overnight. And yet, when I saw it, I hurriedly made a lap of the parking lot. I couldn't wait to start my journey home. I found myself walking in the middle of the road. Usually I walked on the farthest left side, so that cars coming from behind could easily pass. But this night the air was somehow different. The rustle of the wildlife around me changed from aggressively heavy to deathly quiet, and I was afraid to walk too close to the woods. The center of the road made me an easy target for an oncoming motorist, but at least nothing could reach out and grab me unexpectedly. When I was about a third of the way home, I heard something in the woods that I hadn't heard before. It was like a distant voice echoing faintly off the trees, but I couldn't hear it quite clearly. A chill ran down my spine, and my breathing stopped. I slowly crawled forward, and the only thing that kept pushing me forward was the thought that I had to get home to be completely safe. It wasn't long before I fully realized exactly what I was hearing. It was a woman's voice that was about 100 feet or so away. She was crying, sobbing. Her voice was strained, and it sounded like she was in excruciating pain. Dozens of scenarios immediately ran through my mind, each one more horrific than the last. Then I remembered that I didn't have my cell phone with me. Whoever or whatever was in these woods, I had a responsibility to my daughter. I had to ensure my own safety, so I rushed home as fast as my legs could carry me. It took me almost 5 minutes to get there. When I entered the house, I immediately called 911 to report that there was a woman in the woods near my house. It took the police officers 15 minutes to get to my door. When they arrived, I told them what had happened. The Dan officers couldn't figure out why I was even out walking. It took another 20 minutes before they got to the spot where I heard the voice and shined a light into the woods. Nothing. They said someone would check the area the next day. I didn't sleep that night. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. I also couldn't shake the feeling that the police weren't taking my statement seriously. But they should have, after all. It was morning. I dropped my daughter off at daycare and headed to work. I was drowsy and my ability to work was suffering. By the time I got to work, I had completely forgotten about the events of the previous night. Those events didn't leave my mind until I was driving home and saw 3 patrol cars parked on the side of the road, near where I heard the voice. There was an officer standing by one of the cars and waving for me to pass by. I slowed down and asked him what was wrong. He answered vaguely, but said there had been an accident. From the way he looked at me and back at me, I realized he was hesitant to talk about it in front of my daughter. I felt my stomach cramp, but continued driving. I knew immediately that something terrible had happened, but I didn't find out until a day later, when everyone in our neighborhood started talking about it. A body had been found in the woods. The body of a young woman. A college student, actually. There were deep lacerations all over her body. Investigators determined that she had been horribly abused elsewhere and left to bleed to death alone in the woods. It was a slow, agonizing death and could have been prevented if someone had helped her in time. I told the police about the white van I'd seen near the church that night. Of course, nothing came of it. Nothing came out of the rest of the case either. It went completely cold. I saw the faces of grief-stricken parents on the news talking about what an incredible person their daughter was. Every time I saw her face, I was reminded of my own daughter. A terrible fear gripped me. The fear of realizing that she was being raised in a world where something like this could one day happen to her. After that, I started drinking, regularly like clockwork, until I couldn't think anymore and couldn't sleep. I also stopped taking night walks, at least for a while. Why would I want to risk going through something like that again? But then came the realization that maybe there was something I could do. What if I had conquered my fear and just called out to her? What if I had my cell phone with me and called for help right away? Who was to say that whoever killed the first woman would not leave another victim to die in the woods? About 2 months after that incident, I started going out for walks again. I took my time, trying to make them last as long as possible. By lingering, I thought I was maximizing the likelihood that I would hear someone if they needed help. Back then, I'd always took my cell phone with me, as well as a flashlight. It wasn't long before the neighbors noticed that I was back to my old way of life. This time, they began to treat me with hostility and suspicion. Never mind that I was the one who heard the girl and called the police. I was now the odd man out, still wandering the roads after a local tragedy. They stopped waving at me as we passed each other. If we met in public, they pretended not to notice me. My daughter even told me that many of the kids she went to school with said I was crazy and that their parents told them to avoid me. To some extent, this applied to her as well. At night, my walks got longer and longer each time. I became obsessed with the idea that maybe if I stayed out a little longer, I would have an opportunity to help someone else. This was reaching a tipping point when I had just gotten home from my walk, but I couldn't escape the feeling that this night was going to be different. I had to work the next morning, but can one day spent at work compare in value to another person's life? That night I went for my second walk. I heard nothing. Nothing happened. The next day, my work was terrible. My boss even sent me home early. I usually left work an hour before my daughter was picked up from daycare, but now I had the better part of the day ahead of me. I decided to take a nap for a few hours. I figured I would set my alarm and wake up before I had to pick her up. However, in my tired state, I forgot to set my alarm clock from morning to evening. 15 minutes after I was supposed to come to pick her up, I was awakened by the sound of the bell ringing. As she called to ask where I was, she didn't say anything to me as we drove home. That night I couldn't sleep after dozing off. And even though it didn't make sense, I went for another nighttime walk. And so it went on and on. Each day I felt worse and worse. My relationship with my daughter became strained. Fatigue only intensified my paranoid sense of responsibility for my actions. The next time some sick monster dumped another victim in the woods, I would be there. In the meantime, I drank more and more to dull the discomfort of stress. 3 months ago, I was laid off. My boss brought me into his office and told me to sit down. I knew what was going to happen before it even happened. My performance had deteriorated so much that it was unprofitable to continue working. I never found a job after that. And because of the circumstances of my layoff, I was not eligible for unemployment benefits. I had enough money to get by for a while, but life quickly burned it up, and soon I had to choose between paying rent or putting food in my daughter's mouth. The choice was obvious, but getting an eviction notice was still devastating. The worst was yet to come. Homelessness for a young child was unacceptable. Since there were no relatives for my daughter to live with, Child Services stepped in. I was forced to take a psychological test, the results of which, along with my inability to hold down a job, led the government to conclude that I was unfit to be a parent. I still remember my daughter's screams when the social workers pulled her away from me and told her she had to go with them. That was 2 days ago. I haven't heard from her since. I'm writing this now from one of the computers at the public library. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. I miss my daughter very much, and I wish I could tell her that I am sorry for failing in my role as a parent. The library is closing soon. I think I will walk down my street all night tonight. After all, I won't have to wake up tomorrow.